rolling. I don't know, for some reason that caught me off surprise. What's up, y'all? Episode 8 of The Rising Tide. Here with your hosts, Dayton and Boys and
Dale Smith.
Awesome. We have a action-packed episode. It's our post-May Day episode.
Yeah.
If I had a soundboard, this would be they're in the
air horns.
There'd be
Start doing the international.
I was thinking more like memes, just like little clips from TV series I like. But yeah,
so like the air horn version of the international.
Yeah, or like the international in like Mongolian or something.
Yeah.
Something hip. All right, what's up, y'all? We got an interesting episode for y'all today. All our episodes are interesting, but this one, we got some action-packed stories. We're talking about the Philippines. We're talking about May Day. We're following up from some civil disobediences that took place in the Bay Area. We're talking about an upcoming strike line. Rising Tide is going to a strike next week. It's really exciting. So all this will be in this awesome episode. We're really excited to bring it to you. This is me setting up the teaser. I'm thinking we can do a little teaser before we post the full episode.
Yeah.
We're trying to work on the promo here, trying to make these episodes good. So, their first story we're going to start off is talking about international peace. So, Dale, what were we talking about? What's going on?
Yeah. So some of you might have heard about what happened last month, but essentially there was a massacre that happened on the Negros Island in the Philippines where 19 people were killed on April 19th. It led to hundreds of peasants being displaced, and it was a huge deal. So if you're familiar with stuff that's going on with the new democratic movement in the Philippines, you probably heard about this. Most likely a lot of this stuff flew under the radar for folks because people just don't hear about these things a lot, even when it does involve American activists being murdered by a foreign military, So I think it's important to just kind of read the names of some of the people who passed away recently, because, these are martyrs for a movement that are, they're fighting for liberation in the Philippines. So these first 10 names were people who were a part of the New People's Army. So they're a militant, communist group inside the Philippines that are actively struggling against the Philippine government in an armed revolution. So their names were Roger Fabular, Sonny Boy Karamihan, Rene Villaran, Pedro Banghanoy, Arnel Yavak, Euros Karamihan y Ramos, Maria Clarita Branzel Blanco, Genevieve Balora, Labsky Purisimia Enstacion, and Joel Gimang. I'm sorry if I butchered that. My Filipino is not that good, but I think it's, important to name these folks because, oftentimes when we hear about these different situations where people are being killed in an armed conflict, they're just numbers. But, these weren't just numbers. They were people. They were martyrs. They were fighting for what they believed in. They believed in, liberation for, not just people in the Philippines, but for people everywhere. And it's also important to note, I said 19, these are the folks that I think we can confirm were a part of the New People's Army in the Philippines. But there were also 9 people who were unarmed, were non-combatants. They're essentially civilian activists and journalists and other folks of the like who were also murdered, And so these folks are Roel Sabio, RJ, Nicole Ledsama, Alyssa Alano, Maureen Keel Santuyo, Errol Wendell, Jamina Gamadlas, Lyle Praholis, Kai Surem, and Dexter Pataho. So, it's important to note that, 19 people were killed last month. Of those 19, 2 of those folks were minors. They were under the age of 18. And 2 of these people were Americans, Folks who were Americans were Kai Sorem, he was 26 from Seattle, Washington, and, Lyle Praholis, who's here from the Bay Area. He's a graduate of San Francisco State. He was a part of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, He was an avid Star Wars enthusiast, and if you had spent time in the Bay Area in activist circles, you probably saw his face, By all accounts, he was a great person, but it's just, important to note that all these people were killed so that the Philippine government can keep enacting their, campaign to wipe out any sort of opposition, not just, armed, militant opposition to the government, but even, nonviolent, democratic activists, peace activists, human rights activists. So what the Army of the Philippines was trying to do with this was they were trying to frame this incident, as they do with many others, as an encounter killing by basically saying everybody was an armed combatant. All 20 people that we found had guns on them. They were fighting us, so we had a right to fight back. So this is a common practice that we see in the Philippines, happens a lot in India. I think we've talked about this before, and just other areas where there's resistance against the government. And why do they do this? Well, it's because it's an international war crime to just kill a civilian, and so in order to try and cover up that, militaries like the armed forces of the Philippines do this in an attempt to cover their tracks, and frame any sort of resistance against the government, armed or not, as violent terrorism. Obviously, this is not the case, but also at the end of the day, the UN does recognize that people have a right to defend themselves. People have a right to self-determination. Armed resistance in certain situations is, they consider it justified. Obviously, when we're talking about international law, there's what the law says and how it actually applies, but it's still important to note this. So just for some broader context, there was a report that we might have mentioned in one of our weekly updates, I believe at the end of last year. This was put out by Ang Bayan, which is it's basically like the propaganda arm of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And, one of the things that they do is they try and investigate human rights allegations, and violations that are happening on behalf of the Philippine state. So, in 2025, we saw that 264 people were killed by the Marcos regime. And there was at least 240,000 cases of human rights violations between December 2024 and December 2025. So to quote this report, on average, no fewer of 3 people fall victim to political killings each month, 2 people fall victim to abduction, and 25 to torture every month. Over the past year, 11 people fell victim to the frustrated killings of state forces. So the vast majority of people who are affected are peasants, a lot of people who are poor and live in urban centers, and about a quarter of those people who are affected are children. Looking at the whole reign of the Bongbong Marcos regime, or the Marcos Jr. regime, however you want to frame it, there's been an estimated 748,000 victims of human rights violations since 2022. A lot of people don't know about this stuff, so we figured it was important to shed some light on the situation, let people know about what's going on, and just talk about it a little bit. I mean, what are your thoughts, Dayton, about all this?
Well, I think, it just makes me think back to some of the encounter killings that happen in India, right? With the people's forces over there. That there's a need to eventually present all forms of resistance, like you're saying, as basically militant. I think that, or as the
Armed
same as if armed
militants,
resistance, as armed as if they're armed, right?
Yeah.
So just by having a stance opposed to the state, they're treated essentially as if they are armed combatants, right? And this need to really misrepresent that, right? And I think that's important. I think it's important that we see this, sort of as we see what's going on and what's going on with Palestine, right? Like, obviously, folks have a lot of awareness over journalists being targeted in Palestine. And I think it's important that we see that, fundamentally, this is where the people's struggle ultimately comes to a point, right? Where people's struggle becomes so widespread that the state's only response is essentially to start, killing and oppressing anybody who takes a stand against them, right? And so, I think it's important that we see, for our own context, that the work we do as activists, as revolutionaries, if it's progressive, it's ultimately not looked positively by the status quo, right? We ultimately, if we continue struggling, it comes to a point, and if our struggles are successful, ultimately the state, be whatever oppressive state, will treat these nonviolent demonstrators the same as it treats armed demonstrators, armed militants, right? They become synonymous from the perspective of the state. And I think it's also interesting, or not interesting, but just you see how the actions of the state have grown so far that they killed 2 Americans. Normally these regimes are known for, again, sort of like the idea of like really trying to downplay what they're doing. They try to like
Hmm.
not target people that can go back and publicize these events later. It makes me think a lot of like the situation Brandon Lee, who is
Hmm.
a similar activist from San Francisco, Chinese American man, married in the Philippines, was an activist there, working with different indigenous communities, and then he was targeted for assassination. He shot like 6 or 8 times in front of his own home in the Philippines, and now is mostly paralyzed, living in San Francisco, right? And I think this is the same basic situation, right? So this is actually an ongoing issue of peaceful activists, even coming from abroad, coming to participate in the Philippines and themselves targeted. And I think that was a different administration, right? That was doing under Duterte, right? So we have like just two examples
Hmm.
of two different Philippine administrations maintain this basic position of basic hostility toward the people's movement, moving
Hmm.
more toward fascism, and targeting any types of activists under this idea of like public safety, public security, right? You can also draw some ties to how Trump talks about immigration, specifically the conversation around these anti-ICE protesters, calling them domestic terrorists just for, say, having statements about opposed to ICE, or by trying to document ICE activities. We had 2 activists this year killed by ICE officers in Minneapolis and Minnesota just for documenting, or either documenting or trying to involve themselves in sort of these in watching ICE, right? And so, yeah, I just think it's something that we have to be mindful of. It's like, it's the reality of popular struggle here. So it's important that we raise the profile of these martyrs. We understand like the risks that we take on, and then we seriously engage in people's struggle, and also really see it's not just an isolated thing. It's just what's happening to the anti-ICE protesters. It's just what's happening to the folks in the Philippines. It's just what's happening to the folks in India. It's like, no, actually, this is like what's going to happen to all progress. These are the threats they're going to face all the progressive pro-people forces around the world
Hmm.
today as we wage the struggle against principally U.S. imperialism, but imperialism overall.
Yeah, definitely. I think we see how aspects of this already, come back to home. And, that's only going to increase over time as resistance reaches a higher level. Um, and yeah, I think it really underlines the importance that like, these different struggles are connected, because we see, you know, it's raised a pretty high profile in Palestine in particular, where we see these massacring of civilians, and trying to paint anybody as having any sort of like vague connection to armed resistance, and so therefore they're terrorists, and so therefore whatever happens to them is justified. When in reality, it's like no, it's like dissent is integral to promoting any sort of like democracy or pro people society, and to paint all of this with such a broad brush, it's dangerous, it's scary, um, and unfortunately we have a tendency here in the United States to overlook a lot of this stuff, a lot of it because it's just not being presented to us in mainstream media and a lot of these discourses, but just because a lot of people's awareness just isn't quite there yet, it doesn't mean it can't get there, and we definitely saw this after 2023, like a lot more people were staying in tune with what was happening in Gaza and Palestine, and start to raise their consciousness about what imperialism's really doing in foreign countries and even our own. But that just has to continue over time, and we have to really see these things for what they are, and not let these folks' sacrifices be forgotten. They're one piece of a much broader movement, but still an important piece nonetheless. And at the end of the day, we're not saying that people have to die in order for this stuff to be important. Obviously, the best thing is for people to not die and not go to prison. But this is one of one of the realities of the situation, and they really try. The governments across the world really try to make people scared to do anything, by doing stuff like this and by hoping that people don't really try to drill down to what the facts are, what the real situation is. But at the end of the day, we can't be we can't be scared. We can't be intimidated. We have to keep moving forward and remember, who we've lost along the way, because they were fighting for a good cause, and one that hopefully all of us on some level are trying to contribute and move forward. So,
yeah. All right, so we're going to move on to our next story. So we want to do a couple recaps before we start talking about some upcoming labor activity. The first, we want to recap May Day. So May Day, we're about 1 week and some change post May Day. We're recording this episode on Mother's Day.
Yep.
Call your mother figure if you haven't already. So there were over 3,000 demonstrations across the United States. This May Day, school districts in 5 different states had to close for the day due to teachers taking the day off, with around 20 in North Carolina being forced to close for the day, 20 schools to be clear. And so there's a lot of single-day strikes demanding higher wages, fair treatment for workers. And this was a Democratic-led May Day demonstration, was front and center this year, which I think is important to talk about a bit, because I think May Day is an interesting holiday, because May Day is an American holiday that is much more widely celebrated and respected internationally than it is in the United States. I think when we see May Day, we see often a history that has often been suppressed, right? Of the subversive labor movement that has been suppressed by sort of what we'd call the labor aristocratic labor movement, the pro-government labor movement, the Labor Day. Right, I think in the United States we have this idea of Labor Day, which was presented as an alternative to communist anarchist May Day, right? And so May Day was initially around these initial demonstrations for an 8-hour day, versus Labor Day was just like commemorating the working person, no matter who he is, right? And so I think it's important that we kind of see just the role that May Day does tie back to subversive history, and I think it's important for the working people, us involved, activists around, to really try to take that up. And so that's why we're trying to it's why we have the Rising Tide. It's why we have these different propaganda pieces. We're trying to elevate these different things that are going on and really tell you about how we see the world and how we see people coming together. So that's why it's important that the Democrats don't control May Day. Because when they control May Day, their whole goal is essentially to prevent people from making these connections to the revolutionary history, right? It's the same thing with basically No Kings. And I think, Democrat, indivisible, May Day, and No Kings is essentially synonymous. In the sense, it's trying to get a big group of people together and then basically subvert their demands into very simple ones that the system can stand. And we know what the No Kings, DNC, May Day demands are, right? It's all, and I think this is an interesting thing about May Days. A lot of these demonstrations were almost dominantly around immigrants, right? So just, getting people to vote, getting people to trust in courts and the democratic process, right? And then to be nonviolent, right? And so basically the idea that to be these things, right, to do something other than voting, to do something other than using the courts, and to be anything other than totally peaceful and harmless is actually to subvert everything this great holiday stands for. And I think, we should actually oppose that. And I think it's important to see that at this May Day, that despite it being led largely by Democrats and a lot of these establishment demonstrations, there's still some good labor demonstrations. I think for one, there was a demonstration over at San Francisco International Airport, where 25 people were arrested, including Connie Chan. Connie Chan is also running for the congressional seat of the San Francisco Bay Area against a lot of other DNC shills. She's the only candidate I think that we found who's like isn't financially invested in either big capitalist financial companies or just straight up Israel. Like Saikat Chakrabarti.
Yeah,
who is
if you just look at her disclosures, it's literally like, I work for the government. I work for the board of supervisors. But you look at Shoykat's and it's like fucking pages. Yeah, I made that mistake a lot.
Whatever.
It's confusing.
Well, I'm going to say we shouldn't respect him because he's like invested in Zionism. We should absolutely not mispronounce his name. I'm sorry. Yeah. But again, Shaikat is deeply invested in Israel and all kinds of Zionist entities personally. So he personally makes money off of companies that have been listed by BDS to be boycotted from. So that's just important to understand, because he's somebody who's gaining a lot of like left-wing traction. I think even a lot of like Bay Area meme pages have been hopping on his bandwagon recently, taking photos with him. And they might say, it's like, oh, we're just checking it out. But it's like we're giving a platform to a political candidate, right? So if you have a platform, you put somebody on that platform who's trying to seek higher office, you are helping them get higher office, unless you're actually putting them into that position to actually challenge them on a particular issue, right? So I think that's like the big thing, right? So I think that goes back to like basic media literacy that we need to be having when we talk about these issues. So we're not here to endorse Connie Chan. Let's be clear, right? We're not here to even disavow people like Shaikat Chakrabarti, but be very clear, like who's actually participating in grassroots demonstrations and getting arrested, who's deeply invested in companies that are involved in Zionism and the Zionist occupation of the Palestinians. These are basic facts. And so we give you these facts and you can make your decision yourself. It's not a big deal. But circling back on to why there was a protest over at the airport. And so the protesters shut down the departures roadway at the international terminal for about an hour. And so this was in solidarity with about 2,000 airline contracted workers across 5 different companies that have been bargaining for about a year. Right. And so these companies have been yet to sort of respond to these negotiations to put forward an economic proposal. And so the workforce represented in the protest span a range of roles. So these are people like that keep the airport operations running, wheelchair attendants, assisting elderly and disabled passengers, ticketing agents, cabin cleaners, baggage handlers. And so currently at SFO, the airport wage is $22 an hour. And the San Francisco minimum wage is $19 an hour. Wow, I didn't realize it was still that low. Jesus Christ, San Francisco.
It's going to be, I think it turns to 19 at the start of July. So.
Oh, wow. So it's not even that high
Yes,
yet.
not yet.
So the most expensive city in the entire United States pays you just enough money to not even live in Walnut Creek. Wow. Wow, America. So many of these workers are commuting and they're holding multiple jobs. And they're also a large section of these workers are immigrants. And to follow up on some of our previous reporting with one of our roundups, ICE has been detaining people at SFO. They've been working with SFPD to detain people at SFO, if you followed some of our previous coverage. So, the airport is an interesting intersection around a lot of these struggles against ICE, as well as the labor that operate this airport. It's also the worst airport in the Bay Area. It's the worst fucking airport. I fucking hate SFO. I hate how you can walk 30 fucking minutes to get there. Once you get in the airport to get to your terminal, I hate the air tram. I hate the BART to the air tram to your terminal. You always have to walk 30 minutes to get there. It's so big. It's so large for a city of 800,000 people, and you can go nowhere from there. It's ridiculous. It makes me so angry. OAK is the best airport in the Bay Area after Burbank. Burbank Airport is the best airport in America. I don't care what you think. Every other airport sucks except for Burbank. It's the best airport in the world. Best one. I've been to airports all over the world. They all mostly suck except for Burbank and OAK. You just get off the plane and then you're outside. It's amazing. And you're outside. You can get your bus. You can call your Uber. Your friend can pick you up. At OAK, you can just get on the train. You don't have to take a tram to the train. Can you believe that?
Well, they're trying to close that down.
And that is, again, why that's an attack on black people. It's an attack on black people because they don't want us to have trains.
Yeah, they're cutting lots of transit all across the Bay Area. It's pretty sad.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So, that's a little bit about the May Day roundup. We have a couple more roundups. Dale, do you have any thoughts before we zoom into these other?
Yeah, just a couple points. I mean, I think, like the stuff on Shoycott, we definitely don't endorse any politicians. I don't really believe in them. I don't think you can trust them. I think it is important to note that Connie Chan did get arrested at this protest, but also Raphael Mandelman. Mandelman is always somebody who's like touted himself as like a labor progressive person, and then once he got in office, he just turned into like one of the most reactionary people on the board. And so I think although it is significant that politicians would put themselves in this position to get arrested, they also understand that they're enough of a high profile that they can, weasel their way out of it pretty easily.
Yeah, they're kind of also not paying any tickets.
build their image in some way. That's important to note. The stuff on Shoycott, there was they called it a rally, but it was an event. It was an indoor thing. Rallies happen outside unless you're protesting something inside a building, and sorry.
There's no catering at rallies.
Yeah. So and I think at this one we saw, all these different meme accounts that dip their toe in politics in the Bay Area showing up, standing for Shoycott. I think Hassan Piker showed up too. And I see people across the country too being like, yeah, Shoycott's our guy. And I bring up this really basic point. I'm just like, hey, this guy supports AstroTurf candidates that, try to dethrone people who are more progressive. This guy makes money off of, like, I want to say Blackstone,
Yep.
all
Blackstone, BlackRock.
all these different things, and so it's like, and he's also like, worth hundreds of millions of dollars and dumping millions of dollars in ads. When I bring these things up, all people really have to say is, well, they either ignore it or it really just boils down to this kind of like, oh, well, lesser of two evils. It's like, yeah, but like this dude's all talk.
Yeah.
At least we know that Chan has like practical organizing experience. Not to say that I think I absolutely believe that she's going to be the best thing ever, because I don't believe any politician, but like we can at least point to that. And so I think we do. People really keep saying it. You got to be skeptical of any of these politicians, especially when they have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, or in some cases like Tom Steyer's billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars, exactly.
But yeah, I think the stuff about the airport protests was significant. I think there were a lot of different like one-day strikes that happened across the nation, and there was a large presence of like Indivisible, these different like labor unions that are aligned with the Democratic Party and nonprofits and such. But there are a lot of workers out there that are really trying to push things forward. Like I think with the airport in particular, I think that's really significant because it could be leading to a much larger strike, which thankfully would hopefully be across all these different, subdivisions of labor. I know somebody who, at least for a time, worked at the airport cleaning cabins, and he was just talking about how the conditions that they were dealing with were awful. They had to deal with like rats. It's just like inhumane that they would force people to be put in these situations, and they still have to commute there. It's like they're asking for what, like $8 an hour more. That's not that much money, especially considering all that they're doing. This is an important thing that we need to keep an eye on, and it's important to recognize that we need to keep pushing the envelope with these strikes and such, and really try to move past these one-day symbolic days to go even further. So I think it's great that all these folks showed up on May Day, and we saw all these actions all across the country. But it's definitely something that needs to keep building over time. Yeah.
And I think the last thing I'll say on this part, just around the whole influencers and candidates thing, it's just so funny to see like left-wing influencers grapple on to some of these corporate Dems, because this is like the exact same thing that kind of happened with like center liberal and right-wing comics in Trump, right? As soon as like Trump starts like trying to court these different cultural figures, you see all these like male comics just sort of jumping on the train to sort of like pretend or at least joke around with the former president, soon to be president, right? Because the idea was they could create like an opening for their own platform by tying themselves to the administration in some way. And you've kind of seen how that's, basically shot every single one in the foot, And I think in that same way, you kind of see with, in our Bay Area context, you see a lot of these left wings, more subversive meme pages really trying to grab onto Shikot's campaign, because for them, it's like, oh, wow, we can actually get into the mainstream this way, versus actually like, taking a principled stand against like corporate Dems. It's like, you think of all these, all we talk about in the Bay Area about these corporate forces sucking the life out of the Bay Area. It's like, it's right there. Like we should have the basic media literacy to not support the same corporate machine that has basically destroyed the Bay Area, made it unlivable, and it cannot be trusted. So it's important to see that, when this Hassan Piker comes out, and like, I'm not like these people who criticize people like Hassan. The DNC will say like, Hassan is irresponsible because he talks about free healthcare. That's dangerous rhetoric. That's crazy. The crazy corporate dim shit is fucking stupid. Fuck them. But the basic thing doesn't mean that he's like, he actually knows anything himself, right? Like, most of the stuff he says is okay. It's fine. It's whatever. I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, so we'll move on to our next one. So next update I want to talk about really quickly is just the Press Freedom Index came out this week. Journalists Without Borders came out with their annual Press Freedom Index. And the one basic thing that they're talking about is it's like 25-year low in press freedom around the world, with the United States slipping down to 64th. I think we've slid down 7 places in the last year alone. Now, you can wonder why. Another reason to support channels like The Rising Tide, people who bring your news,
support
okay?
Independent media. We're not making any money doing this.
Nothing.
Not spending any money other than what we need to do to make this happen.
Nothing, right? And so, United States is 64th on the Press Freedom Index after Botswana, Ukraine, and Brazil. Can you believe that
Damn,
shit?
that's wild.
That's wild. Botswana has higher press freedom than the United States right now,
Yeah,
which is
good luck
hilarious.
having most Americans point out where Botswana is on a map.
Exactly.
It's
They
like,
cannot,
jeez.
but they have freer press there apparently. So this one thing to think about, like as we see, like why like independent media is so important, right? Because we see journalists being targeted, we see journalism being even just like hold the conversation around like anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, right? Where reporting on the news is treated as like some kind of like hate speech. It's absurd, right? So anyway, we're not gonna get into that one. The next update we want to get into is so the Golden Gate 26 had a pretrial hearing this last week. So those who don't are familiar, in 2024, the Golden Gate 26 were a group of protesters that blocked the Golden Gate Bridge in solidarity against the genocide in Gaza. This was led by a whole swath of different left-wing liberal groups. And so for those who are hearing from outside the Bay Area has like a stereotype that whenever activists don't know what to do, we block the bridge, right? So there's a rally, folks don't know what to do, we just block the bridge. And for decades, this has been considered like kind of like a harmless tactic that people employ when they don't have better ideas to get attention for themselves. And, I think amongst activist circles, it's treated very positively. But I think amongst the general population, people really don't like bridge protests. They don't like being interrupted in their daily commutes to go to their wage slave jobs so they can see a bunch of people who took work off block the highways, telling them how they really need to care about international issues. And that's not to sort of take the reactionary position, but I think, first thing we have to see is that these bridge demonstrations often really misunderstand what the target in these struggles are, right? It says the point is we're trying to get people to pay attention to this issue versus we're actually trying to strike out against an institution that is actually carrying out this genocide. Right? It's so interesting that as the Palestine Solidarity Movement targets OAK, Oakland Airport, and the Port of Oakland as these places where weapons are being moved to go to Palestine to be used to kill people, and activists choosing to instead move their actions and have those actions at bridges targeting regular people versus at these points of transportation targeting the institutions that are actually moving weapons. That is a real serious choice. And why do people choose that? They choose that because one clearly has like a criminal penalty and one historically is not. Right. And so the Golden Gate Bridge protesters are unique because some of these protesters are facing over 15 years right now. There have been in cases like this is sort of unprecedented because, again, for decades, it's been okay to block the bridge and then they just let you walk off or they just arrest you and they give you a little ticket and they, drop the charges and release you. Right. And so they had a pretrial hearing and where a San Francisco district attorney tried to throw the book at them with setting some of these terms with the judge. So District Attorney Jenkins, she tried to have the word genocide disallowed from entering the courtroom. So she tried to make it so that you couldn't use the word genocide at any point during the trial. She tried to ban the wearing of the keffiyeh inside the courtroom so that nobody, defendants, attendants, could wear a keffiyeh under the idea that it was going to influence the jury. And third, she tried to have likes on social media posts entered into the trial as evidence, right, to try to prove some type of premeditation, so try to create prove some deeper criminality. And fortunately, all three of these motions were rejected, right? So they can say genocide during the court trial. They can wear keffiyehs in the courtroom, and they will not enter likes into social media posts as evidence during this court. So it's a big win for them. However, some of them are still facing up to 15 years if they are convicted of this in this case. And so I think it's just really important that we kind of look at this as like a lesson, right, for the larger movement, because I think the impact immediately of the big Golden Gate Bridge protesters being arrested in 2024 was a pretty serious freeze on the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the Bay Area. Like in one fell swoop, dozens of our young, enthusiastic, intelligent organizers all got arrested and now are no longer participating in the community or able to participate in any work in the community. That's a serious loss in a country as capitalist and imperialist as ours, where our movement is so small. Like if all our young people just get 15 years in prison blocking bridges that don't even transport weapons, going to the places we're trying to protect every single time, they will never get anywhere. There's a real serious issue. I think it reminds me of Huey P. Newton's words Huey P. Newton founded the Black Panther Party, as he talked about to young activists at that time. He was very clear that oftentimes the struggle means that we will have to go to jail. But a revolutionary, often his number one job is to stay out of jail, stay in the community, and stay effective for organizing, to continue working in the community, not just throw your life away to get 15 years just to raise some attention in the news cycle for one day, right? And some of the perceptions of it, the way it's talked about, really does kill me, because I was reading, I think it was an SF Gate piece where they interviewed one of the young defendants, and this is a young student, young woman, I believe, and she was talking about how her role during the demonstration was that she was a police liaison, right? And she said, my job was to interface with the police, and for that entire 8 hours we were on the bridge, I prevented any violence from taking place. Basically, she's taking credit for preventing, like, the cops from brutalizing anybody on the bridge. So she said there's no violence while she sits in jail waiting to possibly receive 15 years in prison. That is violent, right? This police liaison job did not prevent any violence if you're going to still face 15 years in prison, which I think goes back to, like, it goes back to, like, the level of organizing we're still dealing with as a country and as a society as we look to these other movements, right? Like, we've covered some of the work just in the same episode about what's going on in the Philippines, the mentality of people there, where people are actively being killed and shot by the government, right? But meanwhile, in the United States, in our own context, we really even struggle to even define what does it mean what is violence? What is violence? It's that same basic question we as a movement don't understand. Is it talking to the cops to make sure nobody gets beat? Is that violence? Or is getting a bunch of young people to potentially go to prison for 15 years, is that violence? I would say the latter is a much more serious violence that we need to actually prevent if our movement is so weak and needs so many leaders. So we wish them the best in their trial. The hope is that they do not get convicted, and we can continue all moving forward as a movement, and hopefully, like, avoid getting arrested so easily when there's so much work to be done. Because the reality is, as our work comes together, as we get more successful, more people are going to be arrested, more people are going to be jailed, and more people are going to be martyred. But if everybody gets martyred, arrested, all at the same time, we'll never get anywhere.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's definitely true. I think, like, a lot of this in this particular situation boils down to there not really being kind of like a central organization that's really trying to figure out, like, how to move the movement forward. I think this happened on April 15th in 2024. It was in response to this large, like, it seemed like it was a lot of it was happening on social media, where it was calling for, like, an international day to stop the genocide. And there are all sorts of different actions happening all across the world. Some of them pretty positive, like some of them actually targeting, arms and weapons manufacturers, trying to, block factories, trying to actually block ports. They had specific targets. But in the Bay Area, there was the Golden Gate 26. There was also a blocking of, like, a highway, I want to say, in the East Bay. Those aren't really effective targets, and that, I think, really underlines the issue with having a fully decentralized autonomous movement. Like, obviously, things can be pretty difficult if you have, like, an organization that's figuring stuff out. It makes people easier targets. But at the same time, if everything's totally decentralized and, flat, and everybody just decides what they can do in their own space, like, that's when problems like this come forward, where it's like, not only are you not effectively identifying and going at targets, like, people end up getting wrapped up and in serious situations, So I definitely think, we're in solidarity with the folks that are dealing with these charges. We're not trying to see activists ever end up in prison or these types of situations. But really, it's on the movement as a whole to, like, really see this stuff for what it is, and understand that, like, all this is going to do is get people in trouble and get people who might be sympathetic to the cause pissed off about things. As opposed to, like, the Oakland arms embargo is a great example where, there was even a protest, I want to say, going on yesterday, at the airport. And more of these types of actions to happen, because they're actually looking at specific targets and their actionable goals, as opposed to something more amorphous where it's like, well, we got to stop everything. It's like, If it was really that simple, I think it would have happened already. But just these general autonomous calls for like a global day of action, or like somebody calling for a general strike for like the umpteenth time anonymously, these aren't going to move things forward.
Yeah.
You know, people aren't ready for that in general. And there's really a question of whether or not that's going to be ever effective, you know?
Well, yeah, and I think it's that fact that we're so decentralized, that we're so disparate, that people make all these kind of bizarre concessions, or rather just go for all these reaching tactics, try to get basic attention, right? And I think it goes back to like why I really just hate this phrase. This might get me some trouble. It's like this whole idea of diversity of tactics, right? It's like we need to have a diversity of tactics, and it's usually just like a way for us to not have to argue with people who have bad ideas. Right, let's not argue with people who come with bad ideas and just say everyone can do what they want. It's like, no, like some ideas are bad. Like, and we should be able to talk about what ideas are bad or what ideas are less helpful than others. Right. If you're in a nonviolent situation, someone is suggesting like outright terrorism that folks are not prepared to deal with the consequences of, yeah, that's a bad idea. We can't tolerate that idea. If we're like trying to take a militant stance and someone is trying to put forward like liberal pacifism that put forward this liberal humanism and how oppressors and oppressed are basically the same thing and we should all love each other, that's a terrible idea. And I will not participate in actions that are led by or even open to people like that. Or I shouldn't say open, that allow those types of politics to lead the charge. Yeah. Anywho. All right. So our next story that we're going to close on the episode is we're going to talk about a real life strike. It is coming up. So AFSCME, AFSCME is a union. I should explain the context. That's what journalists do. So, all right. So this is a strike that's going to affect the UC system, the University of California system. So for those who don't know, the University of California is the single largest employer and landlord housing provider in the state of California, making it a very massive financial and economic entity, not just in the state of California, but in the country and in the world. Right. And the workers of the UC system are represented by 11 different unions. Most of them are not even permitted to strike as it's written in their own contracts. So it's a very divided situation where you have thousands and thousands of workers working on 10 to 15 different campuses across the state. That are organized. If they're organized into unions, all these unions are kept separate, and often their specific contracts are written so that they actually cannot engage in any work stoppages with their companies. Which is terrible for workers. And so AFSCME, a union that represents dining hall workers, custodial workers, and other maintenance workers, voted to go on an indefinite strike on May 14th. And so this is really significant because it's an indefinite strike, which is like the best kind. Right? Some folks might be familiar with these one-day strikes, one-day additional work stoppages, don't come into work one day. That is totally ineffective, right? Because what the workers do when they call for one-day strikes is they basically declare to the bosses that the boss can just wait and eventually the problem will go away and solve itself. But they're calling for an indefinite strike on May 14th. And so this is very significant. Because the AFSCME union has been negotiating for higher wages as well as higher insurance benefits, and well as I think they're also asking for different transportation benefits as well for workers. And so they have been deadlocked in negotiations where the university has refused to move on any of their demands for over 2 years. And so they've been calling for this strike. And so this provokes an interesting problem because while this strike is sorely needed, while this contract negotiations do need to be pushed forward, the workers at the University of California system don't actually have very much faith in their union AFSCME. And you'd wonder why? Well, it's because their union has actually led them astray for a long time. Right. And so one of the big examples, and this is after talking with different workers and student workers on campus, is that the AFSCME, for the last couple of years, they've called for a series of different one-day and symbolic strikes as these negotiations have been taking place. And what they've effectively done is they've sapped a lot of the enthusiasm of the workers by calling for a series of ineffective labor actions that have not been actually able to push the bosses, the UC system, to actually negotiate. And so this indefinite strike has been a attempt by the union leadership really to keep itself from falling into irrelevancy, as it's really led the workers down a blind alley. And so there's an interesting situation now where the union leadership is trying to lead this struggle. It has actually misled people, and now needs to earn their confidence back in order to win this indefinite strike and possibly push forward to actually get some negotiations. And so it's not looking actually very good for the workers. So it's a very tense situation. And so we're going to be out there on May 14th and 15th for the picket, both days. We're going to be interviewing students. We're going to be interviewing workers. We're going to have some guest reporters reporting on it. So we're going to have some student reporters reporting on it. It's very exciting. And so I think, yeah, this is an important story that we're going to cover. We're going to have a whole piece on it. We're excited about. But Dale, what are you thinking as I bring up this story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is pretty significant, It's kind of reminded me of like earlier this year when the Teamsters for the CSU system went on strike in February. I think at SS State, most notably, they were protesting during the middle of the week while it was pretty stormy out, and it really showed just how serious a lot of these folks were and how important this was to them. This it's kind of like in a similar realm when we're talking about AFSCME, we're talking about, people who work for the university but aren't like professors, and these are, essential for universities like Cal or like any of these other ones, any of these other UCs to function. But it's also unfortunately not surprising that union leadership has dragged their feet on this stuff. I think initially the talk was to have the strike in April, and then it was like we'll have it at the beginning of May, and then now it's like it's happening midway through May, about the time that folks are about to go on summer break. That doesn't mean that these folks aren't going to keep working, but they're missing a potential opportunity to bring in a lot more people into the fold. Especially at a time when like student workers are also looking to organize to try and integrate into AFSCME potentially. And so I think it, in a lot of ways, this does reveal what, union leadership's line really is in these types of situations. Like, generally speaking, like, I feel like it's better to do something than to do nothing at all. But in these types of situations, if they keep dragging their feet and wait till this time, it's not going to be as effective. It just kind of reminds me of like, what was it in 2024 when like the student encampments happened in solidarity for Palestine. I was a part of some of the stuff that was happening at SS State, and I remember it went to a vote. It was like midway through April, and there was a decision to be made. It's like, okay, we're going to make this happen next week, and that was a big deal. But there are still people who were like, well, we need to wait to a more symbolic date, and like, why don't we wait until the end of the term to do this one day thing, or it's so close to the end of term that we can't do anything. But it's like, no, like we still had more than a month left, and people decided to strike while the iron was hot and move forward with it, and that's really what union leadership should have done there. I remember, last month they were talking about it could be mid-April, and then it gets delayed by a month, and that just makes it even less effective. And I think this sort of thing needs to be exposed for what it really is. But also we need to be clear that like this isn't a problem that's just going to disappear. It's not just as simple as like, oh, we don't like these paid union staffers and bureaucrats, so like we'll just hire new ones. Ultimately, it has to be a concerted effort by the workers and other folks who really see unions for what they are, which is an organizing body of the working class to try and push that politic forward that's actually for the workers, and so it requires organization within the union. It probably requires organization outside of the union, and people need to have this understanding. It's like, it's not just as simple as like having a change of the guard, and expecting people not to start acting the same way as the last folks, because that's typically what happened when you don't have these, this deeper organization happening beyond what's already existing. So, I think it is positive that there is going to be the strike starting later this week. It is unfortunate that it didn't start earlier when it could have been a lot more effective and done a lot more damage. But I think it's great that, you and others are going to go out there this week and try and talk to folks. And definitely, just going to say in general, this is something that we would love to do a lot more. If anybody's watching this and you're a part of a union and of like any sorts of like labor actions that are coming up, and either you or someone else that you work with wants to talk to us, we definitely want to amplify those voices, because that's really important, is to empower the workers. I'd say it's safe to say that we're both pro union, but we're also anti bullshit when it comes to unions, So it's like both of those things can be true, and there's a lot of bullshit out there, and we got to call it like we see it when it happens,
Because I think more so than just do workers and the people broadly need unions. We need fighting unions. We need fighting proletarian institutions. They're going to fight for the interests of the working class and not for the interests of managers, not for the interest of union bureaucrats, right? And that is a struggle that the working class has to take up, right? It's not just an issue of what Dale is saying, of just like replacing staffers in another union election. That's something that probably does need to happen in a lot of these unions. A lot of these unions, people need to be fired, right? A lot of the union leaders need to be replaced. That's true. There does need to be a change in the guard. But more importantly, there needs to be a militant labor movement that's going to push these union officials to act right? Because going back to the AFSCME situation, folks have been deadlocked in negotiations for 2 years. They've been doing symbolic labor actions for over 2 years. And it's only now, when it's really clear that AFSCME's dropping the ball in these negotiations, they've been pushed to have this indefinite strike, right? And so we see how labor activists can push these labor aristocrats, these labor bureaucrats, to act within the interests of the workers. But it's class struggle. It's still a class struggle, right? So the workers have to wage a class struggle against these labor aristocrats, against these labor bureaucrats, and they also have to wage that class struggle against the capitalist class. And so it's like, it's one and done, because there's also this idea amongst like the left-wing activists that, well, the unions suck so bad that we just need to make whole new institutions, need to totally start over. And, that, seems appetizing, but what we really mean is, when people say that, what they really mean is they don't actually want to work with workers to actually fight in general. Right? Because if we actually, as activists, labor activists, are unwilling to fight over the fate of the labor unions, then there's no way we're going to be able to fight the bourgeoisie as a class, the capitalists as a class, right? If folks can't organize the workers to oppose corrupt labor officials, then how the fuck are we going to oppose the capitalist state? Like, it doesn't make any sense. One of them bombs children all over the fucking world. And the other one, like, won't let you submit notes and meetings before a committee call, and then will refund your ticket to the conference and won't let you talk. Like, these are two different things. If we can't wage one, there's no way of claiming that we can wage the other.
Definitely.
All right. We are live. Well, no, we're not live. We're just recording this episode to be published at a later date. I lied to you. All right. I'm here with Cassidy Taylor, UC student worker over at University of California, Berkeley. We're talking a little bit about the AFSCME strike, the strike that was not. So folks might have watched our earlier episode. The Rising Tide was preparing to attend a picket line this last week, but in the butt crack of the evening, the strike was called off because AFSCME apparently reached a tentative agreement on the eve of the strike and called it all off. So I'm here with a student worker who is, obviously, Cassie, you're not a member of AFSCME, but you're part of the other student workers that have been trying to be in solidarity with the AFSCME workers. Obviously, an injury to one is an injury to all. So yeah, I'm curious, Cassie, if you can just talk a little bit about, what is the situation between student workers on campus just in general. We don't have to get all that first. Maybe some of their relationship to the AFSCME union. But maybe just to start us off, tell us about why this strike isn't happening.
Well, basically, this is kind of the culmination of 2 years of contract negotiations that weren't really going anywhere for a while. And it seemed that essentially, because AFSCME had spent this time rather than calling for an indefinite strike much sooner, using these little 1 or 2 day strikes as a kind of very almost symbolic amount of leverage against the university, which just, clearly after 2 years didn't get them very far. And as a result of that, earlier in this year, the UC kind of approached the union, and they were essentially like, here's our final offer. you can take it or you can go screw. Um, in which they were planning to offer really nothing. Actually, they were trying to really utilize the lack of leverage that the union had to force through a much worse contract offer than what had been previously on the table. That would have essentially, through various different uh, concessions, have cut pay across the board for um, AFSCME members. Uh, so this put the union in an understandably difficult situation, where they would have no choice but to strike. Uh, and So we were all kind of anticipating that this, given this situation, that they would go through with the strike. But it seems that really they were kind of trying to use the threat of going on strike indefinitely more as negotiating power than reaching the picket line itself.
Yeah, and I think I can imagine after the rank and file that can be incredibly frustrating, right? You
Hmm.
have all these symbolic strikes, which I think it's important for folks to understand, like kind of the difference between like an indefinite strike and some of these 1 and 2 day labor actions. That by declaring how long this labor action is, essentially you're telling the bosses, the people who are trying to push to negotiate, that they just wait around. It's going to disappear, right? Their problems are going to go away. And I also think it's important, on one hand, because strikes are, they're incredibly taxing for the workers, but are ultimately are the only really way to push these concessions. And I know that there was a lot of energy, particularly amongst the young student workers who are, at present not unionized, to really come out in force to support this strike. And, that opportunity was also ended by just quickly accepting this tentative agreement without even actually going forward with the strike, and really trying to just claim an easy victory versus putting in a little effort to win an even bigger victory. Um, Very frustrating,
Hmm.
right? For the rank and file of AFSCME, for these student workers who themselves are trying to get their own contract. And I think it's kind of indicative of how like this really low level of militancy we're seeing across the board. That there's growing interest in unions, there's growing interest in withholding our labor to get a better contract. But at the same time, so much we see like these different craft unions. Leadership is like more interested in appearances and a quick settlement actually than actually fighting for workers' rights. It's interesting. Oh, interesting or terrible, I should say.
Hmm.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a pattern that we've been seeing actually over the course of the past year. Actually, we've seen a pretty like big strike wave in the course of this past year. But so many of these strikes have seemingly, even if they've been victorious, they have really moved to wrap things up quickly. Um, to reach a deal, and then we saw this like with some of the teachers strikes recently, that even though it seems to me those were very successful in the immediate term, um that there was then, once the strike is rolled up, they do like a series of layoffs and stuff like that. And so I think like, while we do see this very promising trend of increasing labor militancy in a very spontaneous way, where like these workers, they want to fight for a better deal. There's an understanding even beyond that, of like, you see the larger political trends in this country. There's an understanding that there's a need for some kind of alternative mode of political change than just, going to the ballot box every 2 years and hoping that you can vote someone in who can, you know, maybe push through like a little bit of change. Um, but while that's a step in the right direction, there's a need for like a coherent labor strategy, I think. It can't just be confidence that like, unions are good, inherently good, strikes are inherently good. If we just go along with this stuff and we just, you know, have ourselves a little strike, then we can get ourselves a little something. There needs to be an understanding of these larger trends at play, and also an understanding of like how the leadership of these unions interfaces with the management, oftentimes playing the role of like a mediator, um, uh, as opposed to genuinely representing the rank and file of the union.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think we see it a lot in our present context in the States. We view all kinds of social changes on the margin, right? I think particularly with the era of Trump, a lot of folks are saying, "Oh, well, anything positive is better than this guy," not really understanding that without like an actual strategy to change the status quo, that's always how we're going to be doing, right? Like all we can get a little bit better is like one or two steps left of overt fascism. Right. Like it's
Yeah.
a little bit more. That's all we can really do. It's like if there's overt fascism, we just got to vote. We got to trust in the courts and be peaceful. If anyone's paying attention to these no kings indivisible bullshit, that's really their basic idea, right? Is just like trust in the system that's put this man in power. The people who are all opposed to him are all basically good people, are all the same. You're one of them too. It's all this nonsense.
Yeah.
And then with these tentative agreements, right? It's the idea is every tentative agreement they come to is automatically just the best it could get for the workers.
Hmm.
Versus, we really have to understand our power as the working class, that when we stay united, when we have this message, this program behind us, historically we've been able to improve, we've been able to achieve all kinds of things. We achieved the 8-hour working day. Remember that was after the 12-hour working day was so in vogue, right? And so
Hmm.
for that, there was the 14-hour work day. If we listened to these on the margin people, we'd still be at the 10-hour workday, just that
Yeah.
basic issue. Folks are talking about maybe in 30 years we can have a 4-day work week. It's like, oh my God, these people, they're cursed
Hmm.
with a lack of imagination.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That.
so I want to be conscious of the time because I
Mhm.
don't have that much with you. So I guess I'm curious a little more, just talking through some of the situation with some of the student workers on campus. Some of your thoughts on them, how they've been seeing this labor struggle, what are some of the aspirations of ununionized student workers, and what do you think is important for them to grasp in the future?
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the big things with this, student workers kind of are in a sort of a peculiar situation, being both students and workers. Um, it's a little bit different than politically than a lot of the other student organizing that you see, where I think, um, because folks like myself are students, we tend to have that same sort of background where people are a lot more politically engaged than maybe some of the people that you meet in your average, like, full-time workplace. Um, but in theory, also still have this point of a material leverage, um, on the university, because we've just seen over the past years, there was this like big upsurge in student organizing a couple years ago with the Palestine encampments, um, and then this incredible like wave of state repression, and then just like a big drop off. I think people really got demoralized by that. And I think, for student workers, there's a hope that this could be present some kind of alternative, in terms of leveraging political action, at universities. Um, if you look at the example of, like in the case of the encampments, um, to my knowledge, one of the only universities which was able to turn that into any leverage, um, uh, for divestment was SF State, and that was because there was links between the students and the and campus labor. Um, Now I don't know how that's played out, but uh, it's the hope is to actually kind of like to demonstrate that there is real power in the working class, and that is something that students really need to prioritize uniting with. Um, and so what we had really hoped with this strike was to uh, to demonstrate that in action, to not only talk about it with our coworkers, but actually show people on the picket line that this is what we can do as like a class movement, that we this is more than just kind of like an abstract notion, but uh, a real means of organizing that we are ourselves could hopefully grasp in the not too distant future. Not only supporting those workers who are already unionized.
Yeah, because I feel like in the student union context or any kind of student context, folks can be so isolated from particular issues, right? On one hand, there's these places of, learning great knowledge, but you actually do become isolated within your own social class, right? And we see like that without this greater class solidarity, that these student groups either go one of two ways. Like one, either they implode internally through some type of sectarianism, petty infighting over what type of language or what type of interpersonal conflicts, just, eventually the whole thing goes kaput. Or, they're just really not able to deal with the waves of either, state repression or even just the different state co-optation that happens in terms of the co-optation of student movements. And so I think this aspect of labor solidarity, particularly of, proletarian class solidarity is so key because it creates the focus, right? Like, and it's with that clarity that the student movement, the movement in general, through actually leveraging labor, can be more successful and hopefully develop a more comprehensive plan about how they're going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also an important aspect of that is, because another kind of problem with student organizing is that you're only in university for a certain amount of time. Even if you take a really long time to graduate, at best that's going to be like the better part of a decade, and then you got to go do something else. And so there's a hope, like, uh, not only to kind of wield this leverage in the context of the campus, but actually to train people to take those lessons that they learned through that struggle with them when they graduate, to really uh, see the working class movement not simply as something that I'm just doing this to buy my time while I'm here. I'm a student. It's normal to want to get involved in various causes, but actually to see that as like this longer term struggle that we all have to grasp. There's really a dire need for this kind of organizing work, and if we can really push people, even just like a handful of people, into that movement on a longer term basis, um, then those people can do, I think, a tremendous amount of good work for the labor movement as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. And with that, we're going to end our segment here.
All
Thank you
right.
for joining us, Cass.
It's been a pleasure.
Episode 8 of The Rising Tide. And folks who have any other questions for Cass and other student workers, they feel free to DM the page, leave a like and a comment, and we'll have further updates from student organizing and organizing in general and labor in general in the Bay Area over here with Rising Tide.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Peace.
Thank you for tuning in for episode 8 of The Rising Tide. Like usual, like and subscribe. If you have any other comments, suggestions for this episode, please drop them in, leave them on the comments, send us a DM. We want to incorporate whatever feedback we get into future episodes. Closing words?
Yeah, just we appreciate y'all sticking with us. Appreciate all of y'all's support. It's coming up about a year that we've been doing this podcast thing. And we definitely wouldn't be doing it if people weren't interested. So, it definitely means a lot to both of us anytime we, talk to somebody and they say they appreciate our analysis and what we're putting out there. And we want to do more of that. And we also want to, talk more about the things that you're interested in. So please let us know if there's any stories that we're missing out on or you feel like you want to learn more about. Definitely let us know because we want to bring that to you. So, yeah.
Cool. All right, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe out there.
Until next time.
Until next time.